Hello and welcome to another episode of the Leo Alves podcast. And in today's podcast episode, I have another guest on. I've been getting quite a few guests on recently, and I have Ashleigh here with me, who I initially came across on the social media platform Threads, and we've been following each other since. And I thought, what, it would be cool to have her as a guest on. But I won't say too much. I'll let Ashleigh introduce herself, what she does, where she's from, and then we'll go from there.
Hey, so thanks again for having me on. And I'm Ashley. I live in Virginia in the States, and I have been a coach for almost 9 years now, primarily with nutrition, health coaching, behavior change, things like that. I really love helping people make sustainable changes, with their goals, whether it be fat loss, performance in the gym, or just having a healthier relationship with food and body image. And I love finding new coaches on Threads. I feel like it's easier to connect with people on there. I don't know why. I don't know. It's a fun place to be. So I've loved getting to connect with Leo and just other coaches alike. So yeah, thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on. Yeah, Threads is it's definitely been an interesting place recently. I definitely have, well, at least from my experience, it's been quite good with its organic reach. Maybe they're just trying to get more people to jump onto the platform if you like written content and maybe you're quite tired of like consistent videos being pushed in your face. It's probably like a nice break in that way as well. So yeah, it's been fun to use in that way. But yeah, as you all know, no surprise to you, maybe to the listener. Well, they would have read the title by this point. But I thought we could discuss common reasons for why fat loss plateaus typically happen. I haven't spoken about this on my podcast for a long time now. I've done it before, but it's been ages and I did it by myself. So it can be fun to have that back and forth today and maybe discuss reasons that you've often come across and then we can go from there. So was there anything you wanted to say before we get started on that?
No, we can really just start on whichever topic point you wanna touch on first.
Okay, do you have one that you okay, I can mention that first. So this will be in no particular order. But the first one why fat loss plateaus can often happen, and this is something I've come across in my experience of just coaching, one-to-one online fitness members, is inaccuracies often, whether it's with calorie tracking, which is the most often. I would say it's mostly calorie tracking and like just too much guessing going on, where really the person who is experiencing a fat loss plateau typically might not have enough experience with tracking their food to be guessing. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I think another thing too is like yes, the inaccuracies for sure. And that's where just like being able to go behind yourself and do some like reflection on how you're tracking, or also um are you having things that you're not tracking? And like I think people that follow fitness coaches online probably see us talk a lot about taking bites and th of things during the day, or taking licks and tastes of things during the day, and how those things can add up over time. But inaccuracies, I would say, is a huge one, especially if someone is, I'll add on to that one, is just like if they're eating out a lot, if they're drinking a lot of alcohol and either A, not tracking it properly, or B, just like they're consuming it a lot in general, which like isn't healthy. And obviously if they're putting that into their calorie intake and adjusting, like AKA not getting food in, they're using those calories for alcohol. That can be a like negative as well to your progress. And so definitely that for sure, as well as just being a little bit more strict with yourself about like, hey, maybe don't eat the last chicken nugget on your kid's plate just because it's sitting there. Maybe just like put it in the fridge and save it, because even though it's in your mind just a little bit, it adds up over the course of the day.
Yeah, there's quite a bit that you've mentioned there that we can definitely expand on. Number one, eating out at restaurants.
Mhm.
I'm sure if you followed even mine or Ashley's content for long enough, it's not something we say you shouldn't do. In fact, I
Mhm.
think I definitely encourage it. I think it's part of a healthy relationship with your food to be at least doing that sometimes, because sometimes there is more to life. But if it's something you're doing like every other day, or you're doing it so often, there does come a point where it's like, okay, like you have to understand that. there is only you don't have full control as to what's going into your meal. You don't know how much butter they're putting in. You don't know how much oil they're using. And all these inaccuracies can just add up a lot. And you do have to accept that, okay, maybe I do need to eat out a little bit less than I am right now. Bites, licks, and nibbles, like you said, they really add up throughout the day where people just don't even think about it. Like for example, it could be the orange juice that you're having right now as you're listening to this podcast episode that you didn't even think about tracking just because you're like, ah, it's just a little bit of orange juice, and or like a handful of nuts, or as you said, the chicken nugget, the last chicken nugget on your child's plate. So yeah, these things really add up during the day, and a lot of people might not think they're worth tracking because they're like, ah, it's just a little bite. Okay, it won't make any difference. And yeah, maybe they're right. If it was like once that was happening it might not make any really a difference. But if this is happening like consistently most days, it starts to add up throughout the weeks, the months, and especially by the end of the year. And if you're in a fat loss plateau right now, that could definitely be worth something just looking into if you feel like and being more honest with yourself.
Yeah, and alongside the eating out at restaurants too is just remembering that being in a fat loss phase and having that goal is temporary. If you have to temporarily reduce the amount of times that you're eating out for the goal, like that can just be a trade-off, and it doesn't have to be, oh, my life sucks because I can't do this. But again, just like constantly remembering that this is a phase and it's not forever. Because I agree, like having a social life, going out to eat with people, enjoying food as like a connection piece is really, really important. Um, but like you said, if it's like every day or something and it's just like places that are maybe not the most nutrient dense places to choose from, it can just make things a little bit harder. So I think that's important. And then one of the other things that you said about what was it? Oh, just like feeling like um you're plateauing and just being more honest with yourself about things. And I wanted to touch on that because I think when people think they're having a plateau, they think that like there's something wrong with them. They think that there's like their body isn't responding. But more often than not, like it's gonna just be because you need to maybe reassess some of the things that you're doing. Like, can you be more accurate with tracking? Are you using a food scale? How do your steps look during the day? Like, are you being active outside of your workouts? And then of course, like the bites and stuff that you're not tracking. So, I think that is definitely something to remember too, is that like you're not broken, and a lot of times just having a plateau, a lot of times it just means that either being patient is a good like a good thing to be, or looking at some of those other things like we talked about.
Yeah, and what you said about accurately tracking, I think that's a massive one as well because it just takes me back to a conversation I had with a one-to-one online fitness member a few months ago. Um, I just noticed there was some like inconsistencies in the data that he was reporting to me, and I was like, and this was for context, it was like his early days with calorie tracking as well. He thought he'd give it a shot and I was like, bro, what are you using to track your calories? Are you using anything to help you? And he was like, just, eyeballing portion sizes. And I was like, okay, that's where these inconsistencies are coming from. And I was like, all right, for let's just say 2 weeks. And if we want to do it for longer, then we can. And if you want to stop after the 2 weeks, you can. Let's use a measuring scale for your food and a measuring jug. And I'll never forget that very next day, he messaged me and he was like, I can't believe that's what 100 grams of rice looks like. And I was like, see, there we go, like that. So yeah, if you're like just starting out with calorie tracking, you can't expect to know exactly what like 100 grams of rice looks like, what one serving of beef might look like, a tablespoon of olive oil. If you've never done this before, especially if you're struggling with maybe just making progress right now. So if you've never accurately tracked before, I think this is just basically like a long roundabout way of saying it could be worth using and being consistent with just equipment to help you in this. Not to say it's going to have to be forever, but it's definitely worth going through a phase of consistently using them.
Yeah, and not only does it help them in the moment, but being able to consistently use something like a food scale or anything for them to gauge what certain amounts, like in grams, look like, that's going to help them down the line when they're not even using it because they did it so much and now they know, oh, that's about 4 ounces of chicken, or oh, that's about 100 grams of rice, or whatever. Um, it's a really good thing to know, and it's a good tool because a lot of people don't know what actual portions look like. Um, as we know from how you said he was just like kind of eyeballing it and not really knowing what to track. And that's understandable because it's very second nature to us as coaches, but for someone new coming into this, it's just like, well, I have an apple here. I'm gonna just log an apple. And then there's like, but then they realize, oh, like this one's bigger than the other one. And like that matters over the course of, days and weeks if you're eating those things consistently. So just building the consistency with the tracking is so beneficial, but then it also allows you to use that knowledge when you're not tracking or when you're not using a food scale, because I really believe everyone should do that at least for a short period of time in their life.
Yeah, I think it's that's so well said. I don't really have anything else to add to that point apart from yeah, so if you there was quite a bit we said there, so like I guess to round up that point, there was like a invest in potentially a food scale, a measuring jug if you haven't already. Also bites, licks, and nibbles throughout the day really do bear those in mind because they do matter over the long term. And then and I think that was pretty much it for the point that we mentioned. Was there anything else you wanted to add before we go on to the next
Um,
one?
I guess like as a new point or to that one.
Oh, like I was going to say to that one.
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot on that one.
Okay, so what was the next one that you had in mind?
I was thinking just about like I think everyone can relate to this like when you start off something new and you're really excited and you're really on point, you're really on top of things, and then you just kind of get, I'm not going to use the word lazy, but you might get a little bit bored of it. You might feel like not as excited because I think whenever we start something new, there is that excitement in starting something. But then as time goes on, you're kind of just doing the same things day in and day out. It can get a little monotonous. So this can create sometimes plateaus for people if there's just like a natural decline in your consistency. What that could look like is Monday through Friday, you're pretty great with tracking. And then on the weekends, your plans might change a little bit. And so you just forego tracking altogether and you don't go all out, but you definitely don't stick with things. Um, and that, again, if you're in a fat loss phase and you are kind of going over your numbers, whether it be a little bit or a lot, it can still add up and then kind of make your progress a little bit slower if you're not careful. So, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I love that you brought this one up because this was like the one I was actually gonna suggest next. If yeah, so I think this is a really good point because yeah, natural decline in consistency after you've been doing something for a while is a lot more normal than I think a lot of people realize. And there's a few I can say about this. You know, a lot of people do sometimes overestimate. I think it's quite often actually people often overestimate their levels of consistency a lot more than they realize. Um, like I've even got like a personal example that sprung to mind again. Like there was I used to work in a gym back in like central London in Fulham, if you know the area that well. And I remember there was an Irish lady I was speaking to, and she was like, yeah, like I was making such great progress, and now make it like now I feel like I'm in a bit of a plateau. And I was like, well, do you have any thoughts as to why that could potentially be happening? And she just basically said, well, every time I make progress, I feel like I kind of just like ease up on myself a bit after a while and I start eating maybe more dark chocolate than I initially like would let myself. And then as the conversation went on, it turns out it wasn't really like just the dark chocolate. It turns out she was just like overeating in a lot more areas and then she was actually less active than she had before. So yeah, that happens very often and there is more I can say, but I don't want to take up all the I don't want to speak the entire time. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you pointed out her activity levels as well because there are just certain things sometimes that people aren't aware of. Like, of course, I'll say it again, like as coaches, we're very hyper tuned to like the different metrics involved that can impact someone's progress, but they're not really thinking about that all the time. They're not maybe aware. It's just like when people say that they got older and they gained weight because of their metabolism, when really they're just less active and they're probably consuming more calories. like it's just very hard to kind of reflect and like look inward and realize like, oh, I have been less active, and oh, like I do kind of overeat a lot more than I did before. But but yeah, I think that's a really, really big one. And I wanted to touch specifically on how this you mentioned about when people are having really good progress and then they kind of backslide a little bit. And I see this a lot, and I think it's just this idea that people get in their heads where they're like, "Oh, I've made it," or "I've made so much progress, I have some wiggle room now." And it's almost like, "Hey, I've made a lot of progress, so now I get to XYZ." But those like why would you like reward yourself for, I don't want to use the word good behavior because I don't like the good and bad scenario, but for consistent behavior, making progress by doing the things that like didn't really get you there. So it's just kind of like a cognitive distortion where you're trying to, it's kind of like a self-sabotaging thing. But it's more about, because I've had clients that do this and they've explained it to me kind of like how I said it. Like it almost feels like you have more wiggle room when really that's not how it should be looked at.
Mhm. So yeah, it's how so let's say in we're in that situation, someone's listening to this and they're like, "Oh my God, that's me." Like, what do you think could be a good way to reframe things maybe to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is like reminding yourself that you don't always have to reward yourself for working hard. I know that can kind of sound harsh, but like think about all the times that you've done something really hard and like it hasn't gone your way. Like you study really hard for a test. You put in a lot of hours and a lot of like actual work mentally and physically, but then you might not get a good grade or you might not get the grade you were hoping for. Like stuff like that happens. I think it's just with food and nutrition, it's a lot more emotional. And of course, food is a lot more emotional. Um, and so, with that being said, seeing progress like that, you almost feel like, or at least probably a lot of people feel like, oh, I'm going to reward myself. But if you actually dig a little bit and reflect and ask yourself, am I actually like rewarding myself? I think most people just don't think a lot about what they're doing. They don't have any real intention. It's just kind of automatic. Oh, I'm going to reward myself. Like, oh, I won this game, gonna go get ice cream. And there's nothing, first of all, there's nothing wrong with that. But in a situation where it keeps happening over and over again, I think it's important to put like a pause between thinking about doing it and like actually doing it and asking yourself, is this in alignment with like the person that I want to be? Like, do I want to always be the person that does this every time I see progress with my fat loss or with like whatever it is? Um, it would be like, this is a very extreme example, but it would be akin to someone that is struggling with alcohol and they're like, I'm 180 days sober, time to celebrate with a drink. Like, no one would ever do that. I mean, they might want to do that, but they wouldn't, hopefully. So it's just, it can seem harmless, but it's actually something that is hurtful if it becomes a pattern.
Yeah, I think you've covered it all really well. I don't really have too much else to add to that one. I did have a psychologist on the podcast quite a few episodes ago, and I feel like there was quite a good analogy he shared in relation to this that I think I could share before we go on to the next point. But and I find that analogies always help the point hit home a little bit more with people. And it's just like, so imagine to the listener, you've got like a ship tied to the shore and it's like securely tied, it's not going anywhere. And every day you're consistently going up to it, checking on it, making sure it's not gone anywhere. And as days go by and you notice you're like, ah, this is like really safely secured, you start to check it a little bit less often, and you don't go as close to it as you were before. And as like time goes on, before you know it, you're like checking really from quite far away. You're checking it maybe once a week rather than every single day. And then before you know it, the ships you're not as you're checking it more sporadically and from further away, you don't actually realize the ship's ropes are loosening somewhat. And then before you know it, the ship's drifted off and you're like, hold on, how did that happen? Because yeah, you just we're just checking it a lot less frequently than you were initially. So yeah, it does happen. And I hope I didn't butcher that analogy too much. It sounded a lot cooler when it came from him. Anyway,
No,
so go
oh,
on.
sorry. I think that was good, and I think that actually is a like a great analogy too for people that get older and don't realize where their weight gain may have come from or how they got out of getting into the gym consistently. Because like you said, you don't realize it until you realize it. And
Mhm.
because they're not like consistently checking up on themselves and like reflecting on their behavior a lot. So I like that.
Okay, yeah, no, it's yeah, when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's lovely. I'm gonna use that someday. I think, did you have anything else you wanted to add before I bring up the next point?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so the next one was I think becoming more intentional. And what I mean by this is sometimes when you start something new, so to the listener, you're like, and maybe let's say you've got a lot of weight to lose, like a lot. And when you're starting out, you can kind of, as long as you're like making somewhat of an effort, you can kind of see progress. Like if you've gone from doing nothing at all to being like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to start every morning with like my morning with a 10-minute walk. And that might help you see progress. And you're kind of just like giving yourself a few rules, nothing too like specific that you're following. And again, because you've gone from doing nothing to doing something, even though there's not really a plan there, you're seeing progress. And again, you've got a lot to lose, but as time goes on, and let's say you've lost a bunch of body fat, now that you're a much lighter version of yourself, you get to the point where if you've gone, maybe if you're at a plateau, you're like, hold on, like, why isn't what I was doing working before? And maybe you're just at the point where you have to become a little bit more intentional. You need to maybe actually start having somewhat of a plan because you can I don't want to like I don't want to confuse it by saying too much, but yeah, you don't want you want to start maybe having a specific step goal, maybe have an idea or have specific guidelines that you're aiming for, rather than kind of like winging each day, but trying to be mindful. Yeah, start having specific guidelines, or maybe consider a specific nutrition approach, and sometimes that can be enough to get the ball rolling again, I find.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. Like what I think like what gets you from one point to another point might not get you to that next point. And like you said, when someone's doing nothing, it's very easy to implement the smallest, simplest thing and for them to see a lot of progress. Um, but then as time goes on, as you stay consistent with that, you're gonna have to pull strings elsewhere to get more effective results. And so yeah, like you said, if you've been doing no planning, like implementing some planning, and then maybe down the line, once you find that you need to change something again, the planning process might look a little bit different, or maybe you're going to be increasing your steps, or um, like always just like constantly trying to refine things, basically.
Yeah, and yeah, it's like I think a good example of this could be I think this was ages ago, but I remember I was having a chat with a lady on the gym floor, and she was just like, you know what, like I just cut out, all I did was cut out soda, and I lost like 10 kg. And I'm assuming she must have been drinking a lot of soda before, but yeah, that's all she had to do. She literally just cut out soda. Maybe it wasn't as much body fat, maybe it was like 5 kg, but she still saw a considerable amount of progress. But then it got to the point she was like, okay, I'm no longer losing anything. I don't know what to do. And that's a really good example of it. Maybe you have to start becoming, yeah, pulling strings from other areas. And um, I guess to kind of use an analogy again, although it's kind of like still in the realm of like health and fitness, is like when you start resistance training for the first time, there's something called like newbie gains, which is basically where you can kind of just turn up to the gym. And I like to jokingly say like you look at a barbell and you're going to see like strength training progress. Like you can just do anything basically, and you're going to see progress with your muscle and strength because again, you've been doing nothing for potentially many years, and you're all of a sudden you're lifting weights. It doesn't even matter maybe if your form is not very good, if you've got no planning, if you've got no idea what you're doing, like you might still see progress. And many people do. That's what's called the newbie gains phase. But eventually that phase can only last for so long. There does come a day where it comes to an end and you're like, hold on, okay, what do I need to do now? And that's where you need to start being more intentional with like your workout programming, maybe how many sets you're doing, maybe logging your progress. So you're logging your lifts down and you can ensure like you can see which exercises are working for you, which aren't. But yeah, that's just a way to potentially think about it as well.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of tag on to the example of the soda and then also tie that into a new topic unless you have something else you wanted to say. Um, but I wanted to just give kind of a like an idea for anyone listening for why that happened for her. So like if you think about a can of soda, I'm pretty sure most of them are around like 140, 150 calories. So if this person was drinking 2 to 3 of them a day, that'd be 300 to 450 calories a day just from soda, which that would be a pretty good deficit if what where she was at before was her maintenance. But now she loses, like you said, 5 to 10 kilos. Um, Now, in order for her to be at a new maintenance, like it's going to be a little bit lower due to metabolic adaptations and just the fact that she's a smaller human and she doesn't need as many calories. And so that's why for her at that point, if she actually was like doing everything the same, didn't change anything except like her body weight just stopped going down, like then it's a good idea to say like, hey, do we need to reduce our calories now because she weighs less, she stopped seeing progress. So at that point it's like, okay, do we decrease calories? Do we increase movement? And that can be a good way to offset that, quote plateau for her.
Yeah, and I think well, I started like if you're listening to the podcast and not on YouTube, I started smiling because I was like, yeah, I can see exactly where Ashley is going with this one, and I think this really is a nice transition. It's yeah, it happens as you become like maybe like a smaller, lighter version of yourself. Yeah, metabolic adaptation eventually does happen. For example, like one thing that might happen from it is like if you've been in a calorie deficit for a long time and you're intaking less calories, sometimes your body tries to like help with this, or almost like you could say like quote unquote by maybe you fidgeting less, you like moving around less, or just small tiny actions throughout the day that you were probably doing a lot more frequently before without realizing you're now doing it a lot less. And these are like slight changes that happen as well, just once you've been in a calorie deficit for a good while, and this can definitely result into just a plateau down the line.
Yeah, and it's why it's good to be intentional about like movement outside of the gym because if you're not like fidgeting as much, if you're not just like moving around as much during the day, it can be very easy without actually like knowing that you're burning less calories throughout the day. So being intentional about movement, such as like your step count, um, and other ways to increase it, like without just intentionally going on walks, is like parking further away from places, taking the stairs, just like little easy ways to intentionally increase your movement, because at least you're in control of that versus those like unintentional things that you're doing that you're not aware of, such as like not talking with your hands as much or not fidgeting as much or not wanting to get up and move around as much. Because I mean, think about like when you're sick, getting off the couch to get the remote or going to get a snack is like awful. You're just like, can someone else do this for me? So, like, you don't realize it, but those are actually ways that your body is trying to conserve energy because you're tired. So, when you're not consuming a lot of calories, it's very normal for your body to not want to expend extra energy for no reason.
Yeah, and I think that's the where the myth of starvation mode sometimes stems from, where people, yeah, certain pockets of social media, I see them, they're convinced that you can gain weight in a calorie deficit, which is called starvation mode. But yeah, that's a myth, and this is, I think, where it's stemming from. So it's just I guess, a lack of understanding. But now you know. Was there anything else you wanted to mention on that point as well?
Um, I guess since you mentioned starvation mode, the one last thing I will say, if anyone actually still believes that that's a thing, go look up the Minnesota starvation experiment on Google, and you will see how these people in controlled conditions didn't eat. They had very controlled diets, and they lost lots and lots and lots of weight. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up as well because some people do get quite I'm sure it's not usually a listener to the podcast, but like I have seen pockets on social media where you do debunk that, and some people just get like very overly emotional
Yeah.
because they're convinced that it is true because it happened to them or someone they know, as they claim. Um, but yeah, but in fact, it's for the reasons that we mentioned. So yeah, another point that I thought I could mention. There's two that I have in mind, and one is sometimes. So we mentioned inaccuracies earlier. Sometimes it's just an inaccuracy with the way someone might be. I feel like this is a no, this is actually, this can be quite common. Inaccuracies with the way people are taking their data. So let's say, for example, and by that I mean, let's say, for example, you're using scale weight as an indicator of whether or not you're progressing. So aside from the fact that you don't really want to just rely on scale weight, or you don't want to just rely on scale weight to show whether or not you are making fat loss progress. Sometimes I have encountered people where they just weigh themselves at random track times during the day. Like on one day, they might weigh themselves like first thing in the morning in a fasted state, and then the next day they might weigh themselves after lunch, and then or the next week they might weigh themselves after lunch, and they're not thinking, hold on a minute, like the reason why 1 kg heavier than I was last week isn't because I've gained 1 kg of fat. It's just because I have eaten a pizza and I've got a pizza like literally right inside of me right now. Like, so they're not thinking about these inconsistencies. And I'll never forget this. Like, I remember when, so back to when I was working in a gym, I had a lady. So I was taking a gym class, and then I'll never forget, like, after I think 5 minutes later, I saw her, and and she was weighing her. So there was a scale in the gym. My manager put it there, and I remember she weighed herself, and she was just basically like, "Why does the scale not go down?" And I didn't quite catch her. Can't remember if we had that chat, but I just remember thinking, yeah, you just literally, I saw you like drink like half a liter of water just now, and it's about realizing these things that are definitely impacting your scale weight reading.
Yeah, for sure. And it's again another one of those things that people just like we're very aware of why that's not accurate, but so many people don't really think about it. Like they don't think, "Oh, I've had food and water. Like that's why I'm heavier." But yeah, that would be a really, really big one for people to remember is like keep it consistent in the morning, right when you wake up, like just weigh yourself. And that's going to be the most consistent. And then also too is just like weighing daily versus once a week. I know some people think differently of this depending on like your relationship with the scale, but if you wanted to measure it, like the more data, the better. So like if you're looking at daily weigh-ins, you're going to get a weekly average and it's going to be more accurate than if you're just doing once a week. Um, Again, not that the scale is the only thing that matters, but if you're only weighing, like let's say one day you weigh in and then next week you weigh in on like the highest day of that week, like it's gonna look and feel different to that person when they see it and they're like, oh, I didn't make progress versus if they had gotten every single day's weight, and then you can like have a better, more accurate average for the week.
I find that daily weigh-ins alongside like taking measurements maybe once every 2 weeks can is really good, because sometimes you'll see that like scale weight isn't going down, but measurements are, or
Mhm.
measurements are going down, but scale weight isn't. And that's why I find like they complement each other really well. And like you said, the more data you have, the better. And you can use that potentially alongside like progress pictures. Are you gaining strength in the gym?
Mhm.
And yeah, those help immensely. And I think in regard to how to consistently or reliably take scale weight, I would say, yeah, I would suggest don't take it at random times during the day, because then there's just so many external variables that can impact your scale weight. Or well, you can, no one's stopping you, but just understand that there will be a lot of external variables that will be impacting that reading. So what I would personally suggest, I find that doing it first thing in the morning after waking up in a fasted state, after using the toilet, is just it's a much more consistent way. Is it perfect? No, but it's probably the way that's going to eliminate the most variables that can impact it otherwise throughout the day. And then doing that daily or as often as as often as possible alongside measurements, you're going to have much more reliable data there.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm. Did you have another point in mind, or
Um,
anything you wanted to add?
I don't think I have anything to add. I'm trying to think of some other things.
I have one.
Yeah, let's hear it.
You're not in a deficit. You're not in a plateau. You're not, like, sometimes, and the listener might be thinking, like, what do you mean I'm not in a plateau? And I'm just like, sometimes people don't understand how long like it actually takes to see a plateau. Like, your scale weight not going down after 3 days isn't a fat loss plateau. Like, I want to make that clear. Like, it takes up to like 2 or 3 weeks to see whether or not you're in a fat loss plateau. Like I've seen it many times before where someone's scale weight won't budge for like 10 days, 14 days, and then on week three, or like just about as week three is about to start, they get a massive whoosh on the scale. And I did a fat loss 30-day fat loss documentation. I think it was back in May. Um, there were days where I was putting it on my story every day, and I remember there was a time where I was like, I didn't see my scale weight was fluctuating within like the same 0.5 kg for like 11 days straight, and I was saying on the even on the 11th day, I'm not changing anything because this hasn't been going on for long enough. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep being consistent with my current plan. I'm not going to do extra or do more. And then on day 12, I think I saw like a 1 kg drop, and then after that, I think like 3 days after that, I saw like another 1 kg drop. So yeah, sometimes it's just about some patience. And I had a one-to-one on my fitness member as well. Shout out to Laura, she's lovely. She was like, "Oh yeah, I'm loving the strength training," and I know she won't mind me sharing this. Like it was a few months ago. She's like, "I'm loving the strength training, Leo, but I'm just I feel like yeah, I'm just the plateau right now that I'm in is the fat loss plateau is frustrating me somewhat." And so we were on a video call, and I looked at her data, and I was like, "Fat loss plateau, like you've lost a 0.5 kg every week for the past 3 weeks." And then she was like, "Oh yeah." And do you know what it was? I think it was also, and this is really, I think, good to highlight, is that we had gone through like an aggressive fat loss phase for like 5 weeks, a few months before that. Just as a 'cause sometimes they have their time and place, and we felt like, okay, this could be good to implement now just to help motivation go up a little bit higher. And I think she was just comparing her rate of progress to what she had seen then. And sometimes when if you've got like expectations that aren't in the right place, and sometimes you convince yourself that maybe you're in a plateau when in fact, no, you're fine. You're exactly where you're meant to be. You're making progress. You're great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so true. And expectations and comparison matter so much. Because I had a similar situation with a client too, like thinking, like, do we need to change anything? She was asking, like, does her progress still look good? And is she plateauing and things like that? And like your client, this client also was used to seeing a lot bigger drops every single week because she did have more to lose initially. But also another thing to remember is that like as you get smaller as well, your drops are going to be less aggressive as you get lighter and leaner. Like 1% of your body weight at 300 pounds is a lot more than 1% of your body weight at 200 pounds. Um, and I think people just have this expectation, whether it be from yo-yo dieting or crash diets, that the fast weight loss is normal for any situation. And it doesn't mean that the slower the better is always necessarily true, but typically more sustainable fat loss, and what feels more realistic on a day-to-day basis is going to be a little bit slower than something that's like really extreme.
Yeah, no, yeah, very well said. And I think this kind of takes me back to what I said earlier. This is why it's really important to take like different indicators of progress as well, where you might think you're in a plateau because you're only taking scale weight. But had you taken measurements alongside that, you would have noticed that maybe your measurements have dropped every single week for like the past 3 weeks or something. So yeah, because the scale doesn't just measure um fat, and I think this is something worth mentioning. You might lose 0.5 kg of fat, simultaneously gain 0.5 kg of muscle. I'm just throwing numbers, random numbers out there, because you've been resistance training, you're keeping your protein high, um, and you don't know that, and you think you're in a plateau because, yeah, you're just not being, you're not aware of the body composition changes that are happening, because you're not taking these other indicators or perhaps paying attention to other indicators.
Yeah, I'll have clients all the time tell me, the scale isn't moving, but like my clothes, I can definitely feel like they're fitting me differently in the waist and like in the legs and whatever else. So it is good to, like there's nothing wrong with wanting to see the scale go down, but if we put all of our focus on it, it completely makes us blind to all the other forms of progress we could be seeing. Not to mention, it's just important to not hyper focus on something that we can't fully control. There are other things that we can control, like the behaviors that we have every single day, our consistency, things like that. And the scale, of course, it's normal to go down in a deficit, but we can't actually control the speed when it comes to, or we can't control what the number is going to say. We can control the speed, like in terms of how aggressive your deficit is and things like that. but we can't actually say like, I want the scale to say this tomorrow, and if it doesn't, like I'm gonna be mad. That's just not how it works.
No, exactly. Um, yeah, otherwise that is pretty much it from me on that point. Um, and do you know what, actually, before I do move on, I think one more thing to add to that point. Yeah, I think sometimes it's also just a fact maybe, you're comparing yourself to what you see on social media, which I guess is kind of a different subject as well. But yeah, sometimes you might think you're in a plateau just because, you see all these physiques on social media. You're not realizing you're comparing yourself maybe to like the top 0.1% of like genetics, which because the social media algorithms they push outrageous content to the top to keep user time as high as possible. And part of that is like if you're following health and fitness content, sometimes they're going to push a lot of like the top physiques. And if you keep just to keep people on the platform where people are like, whoa, and then because you start seeing it so much after a while, you start to think that's the norm. And then because you think that's the norm, you feel like you're not making progress, whereas you're actually fine. You're just comparing yourself to either genetic outliers, people who aren't being honest about what they're taking behind closed doors, whether it's steroids or not. Not that I'm against steroids. It's just that a lot of people aren't transparent with it, not realizing that they've got like the best lighting ever, or or instead maybe they took these pictures like 2 years ago and they're just recycling it, and they're not mentioning that either. So there's a lot you have to really be aware of, and all of that is just to say sometimes you have to be very mindful of who you're following and who you're subscribing to, and I think that's very important as well.
Yeah, the comparison one is huge. And then also to piggyback on that is that just because someone looks a certain way doesn't mean that their lifestyle is healthy.
Mm.
Um, they could have an eating disorder. They could be struggling mentally. Like we don't know. Like so that's another thing to remember is that it's a highlight reel. And yeah, leaner all the time isn't better. So
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Was there any other points that you had in mind or anything else you wanted to add to anything we've said before I move on to the second and final part of this podcast episode, which I can't believe it's been almost 45
I
minutes.
know the time has flown. I think we covered a lot. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that I would add to what we said.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of good nuggets in there for the listener. So what I was going to mention is like sometimes towards the end of the podcast episode, I like to do like a little bit of an overrated, underrated, or properly rated thing where it's just like fitness and non-fitness related stuff. And you can go into as much or as little detail as possible. So I'll say the first one, green powders.
Overrated.
Yeah. Anything you want to add to that? Why?
I mean, I would say for most people, like it's expensive, it doesn't taste good, and you'd be better off for like just eating vegetables. Like if you want to spend your money that way, go for it, but I'd rather just not and eat vegetables.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Solo traveling.
Um, I've never done like a solo travel trip, so I don't know if I can accurately respond. I would say it's probably underrated though.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I would agree. I think if you've never done it before, it's definitely worth doing. It's definitely
Yeah.
trying out. Okay, so next one. Um, Netflix is a streaming service.
Mm, I would say it's properly rated.
Oh, really? Yeah, I was a while ago.
I,
Go on.
oh, I was just saying I use it and I like it. So I feel like it's not overrated because like I get use out of it, but I wouldn't say it's underrated either.
Yeah, fair play. I think in 2022, I was just like, this is at the point where I just think it's overrated and I cancelled it. And then last year I came back to it and I was like, this feels quite good now. Um, Meal plans. So like giving someone a plan, telling them what to eat, what time to eat, what portions to eat.
Overrated because I don't agree with them.
Mm. If the listener is
Agree.
listening to this and they're thinking like, why? What do you mean you don't agree with them?
So I think that a meal plan, they can be very restrictive. They can enforce a client to not have a lot of autonomy and say in what they're eating. And unless it's for a very, 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 very specific reason, they're just not very helpful in terms of like someone actually making like a lifestyle change or like knowing how to operate without it, unless you specifically implement that with them. But I would say in most cases they're not helpful.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. I think it's a bit like telling someone always what to do or when to eat or what time to eat or what to eat. It's like it might help them for the first few days, but you're not really helping them learn any new habits over the long term.
Right.
Or yeah, it's like a bit like that saying, teach a man to fish and you, am I going to butcher this? Teach a man to fish and you feed him. You know
I
the
know what
saying,
you mean.
yeah, that
I know
one.
the saying,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's the one. That one fits really well in this situation. So next one, have did you was there anything else you wanted to add before I go to the next point?
On the meal plan.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I think we said enough.
Okay, having a goal weight.
Overrated. I think I think attaching your progress to that like can set you up for disappointment. Again, like there's nothing wrong with having like an idea of where you want to be, but like would you rather look a certain way or be a certain weight? Because that's something that you have to remember too, is that the way that you want to look isn't always going to be tied to a number. And if you're putting all your eggs in one basket with that number, then like you're just automatically setting yourself up for probably feeling disappointed when there's so many other ways that you can measure progress, measure your goals, and keep them a little bit more, I guess, realistic within your expectations.
Yeah, I agree. I think, having a goal weight on a fat loss journey is one thing, but if it's going to impact like whether or not like if you're going to weigh yourself and you're not getting where you want to be in regard to the goal weight and potentially the deadline you've given yourself, whether that's going to impact whether or not you're going to have a good day or a bad day, how you're going to feel, how you're going to approach your nutrition, are you going to be frustrated? And I really think you should probably consider not, because especially if you're the type of person who's like giving yourself a goal weight and then a deadline, and then you're like 2 weeks away from your deadline, you're not as close to your goal weight as you want to be. So then you just stop completely. Like that just definitely doesn't help anyone. Was there anything else you wanted to add before I go on to the last one?
Um, no, I mean, other than I agree, I think the deadline especially is like making it so much worse. Because again, like I've said before, you can't control how fast or how slow things move. So, like attaching this arbitrary date for some reason, it just kind of sets you up to be disappointed. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree. So on to the last one. So while I was composing this list alongside my cousin, and I was like, all right, give me a TV show. Just I asked him, and he was like, Breaking Bad. So Breaking Bad.
Uh, I love Breaking Bad. I'd say it's properly rated.
I've
It's a
never
good
seen it,
It's a good show. You
so
should
I
watch.
I should watch it.
It's a
Yeah.
little dark, but it's a really good show.
Yeah, that's fine. Dark isn't
Yeah.
something that would put me off. Okay, I'll
Yeah.
have to. A lot of people have mentioned it to me, and he's been bugging me to watch it. He's staying with me for the summer, so so yeah, I'll probably have to watch it with him. So Breaking Bad, properly rated, you said?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay, all right then. Yeah, thank you very much, Ashley, for taking the time out to coming on the podcast and having a chat with me today. That was fun. That time absolutely flew. We were just like listing off those
I know.
one after
Yeah.
the
Thanks
other.
for
Yeah.
having me on.
So yeah, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram and Threads because it's the same username at Ashleigh Marie Hubbard, and you spell my name Ashleigh. And then I also have a podcast called The Wellness Diaries, so you can find me there. Um, and my business is called Ahab Nutrition, so you can find me on my website at ahabnutrition.com. But yeah, I'm thanks again for having me on. Thanks for making it work with our weird time difference.
Yeah, I'll link all if you're listening, I'll link all of Ashley's like Instagram page, etc., in the show notes of this podcast episode. So you can just click on the show notes and all the links will be there. But yeah, the time zone is something I always have to be really mindful of. You in Virginia, I'm in Portugal right now, and I'm like throughout the day I'll like check it like 2 or 3 times just to be certain like I'm not messing it up because that happened once a few years ago. So I'm always like very regimented with it nowadays. But yeah, I appreciate it immensely for you coming on, taking the time out. If you're listening from Ashleigh's side, or you're listening to this episode from a link I might have shared, then yeah, please do consider subscribing to the podcast, to whichever platform you're listening to it on. If you enjoyed it, you don't have to give it maybe consider giving it a 5-star review, because it does help the podcast grow immensely. And otherwise, thank you very much. See you guys around.